Chapter 14, Division of Labour and Manufacture. Section 1. Twofold Origin of Manufacture. That cooperation which is based on division of labour assumes its typical form in manufacture, and is the prevalent characteristic form of the capitalist process of production throughout the manufacturing period properly so called. That period, roughly speaking, extends from the middle of the 16th to the last third of the 18th century. Manufacture takes its rise in two ways. 1. By the assemblage, in one workshop under the control of a single capitalist, of labourers belonging to various independent handicrafts, but through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. A carriage, for example, was formerly the product of the labour of a great number of independent artificers, such as wheelwrights, harness-makers, tailors, locksmiths, upholsterers, turners, fringe-makers, glaziers, painters, polishers, gilders, etc. In the manufacture of carriages, however, all these different artificers are assembled in one building, where they work into one another's hands. It is true that a carriage cannot be gilt before it has been made, but if a number of carriages are being made simultaneously, some may be in the hands of the gilders, while others are going through an earlier process. So far, we are still in the domain of simple cooperation, which finds its materials ready to hand in the shape of men and things. But very soon an important change takes place. The tailor, the locksmith, and the other artificers, being now exclusively occupied in carriage-making, each gradually loses, through want of practice, the ability to carry on, to its full extent, his old handicraft. But on the other hand, his activity, now confined in one groove, assumes the form best adapted to the narrowed sphere of action. At first, carriage manufacture is a combination of various independent handicrafts. By degrees, it becomes the splitting up of carriage-making into its various detailed processes, each of which crystallizes into the exclusive function of a particular workman, the manufacture, as a whole, being carried on by the men in conjunction. In the same way, cloth manufacture, as also a whole series of other manufactures, arose by combining different handicrafts together under the control of a single capitalist. Footnote. To give a more modern instance, the silk spinning and weaving of Lyon and Nîmes is entirely patriarchal. It employs a large number of women and children, but without exhausting or ruining them. It allows them to stay in their beautiful valleys of the Drôme, the Var, the Isère, the Vaucluse, cultivating their silkworms and unwinding their cocoons. It never becomes a true factory industry. However, the principle of the division of labour takes on a special character here. There do indeed exist winders, throsters, dyers, sizers, and finally weavers, but they are not assembled in the same workshop, nor are they dependent on a single master. They are all independent. A. Blanqui, Cours d'économie industrielle, recueilli par A. Blaise, Paris, 1838–39. Since Blanqui wrote this, the various independent labourers have, to some extent, been united in factories. And since Marx wrote this, the power loom has invaded these factories, and is now, 1886, rapidly superseding the handloom. Added in the 4th German edition. The Krefeld silk industry also has its tale to tell about this subject. Friedrich Engels. End of footnote. 2. Manufacture also arises in a way exactly the reverse of this, namely by one capitalist employing simultaneously in one workshop a number of artificers who all do the same or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needles, This is cooperation in its most elementary form. Each of these artificers, with the help perhaps of one or two apprentices, makes the entire commodity, and he consequently performs in succession all the operations necessary for its production. He still works in his old handicraft-like way. But very soon, external circumstances cause a different use to be made of the concentration of the workmen on one spot, and of the simultaneousness of their work. An increased quantity of the article has perhaps to be delivered within a given time. The work is therefore redistributed. Instead of each man being allowed to perform all the various operations in succession, these operations are changed into disconnected, isolated ones, carried on side by side. Each is assigned to a different artificer, and the whole of them together are performed simultaneously by the cooperating workmen. This accidental repartition gets repeated, develops advantages of its own, and gradually ossifies into a systematic division of labour. The commodity, from being the individual product of an independent artificer, becomes the social product of a union of artificers, each of whom performs one, and only one, of the constituent partial operations. The same operations which, in the case of a paper-maker belonging to a German guild, merged one into the other as the successive acts of one artificer, became in the Dutch paper manufacture so many partial operations carried on side by side by numerous cooperating labourers. The needlemaker of the Nuremberg Guild was the cornerstone on which the English needle manufacture was raised, but while in Nuremberg that single artificer performed a series of perhaps 20 operations one after another, in England it was not long before there were 20 needlemakers side by side, each performing one alone of those 20 operations, and in consequence of further experience, each of those 20 operations was again split up, isolated, and made the exclusive function of a separate workman. The mode in which manufacture arises, its growth out of handicrafts, is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it arises from the union of various independent handicrafts, which become stripped of their independence and specialized to such an extent as to be reduced to mere supplementary partial processes in the production of one particular commodity. On the other hand, it arises from the cooperation of artificers of one handicraft. It splits up that particular handicraft into its various detail operations, isolating and making these operations independent of one another up to the point where each becomes the exclusive function of a particular labourer. On the one hand, therefore, manufacture either introduces division of labour into a process of production, or further develops that division. On the other hand, it unites together handicrafts that were formerly separate. But whatever may have been its particular starting point, its final form is invariably the same, a productive mechanism whose parts are human beings. For a proper understanding of the division of labour in manufacture, it is essential that the following points be firmly grasped. First, the decomposition of a process of production into its various successive steps coincides here strictly with the resolution of a handicraft into its successive manual operations. Whether complex or simple, each operation has to be done by hand, retains the character of a handicraft, and is therefore dependent on the strength, skill, quickness, and sureness of the individual workman in handling his tools. The handicraft continues to be the basis. This narrow technical basis excludes a really scientific analysis of any definite process of industrial production, since it is still a condition that each detail process, gone through by the product, must be capable of being done by hand and of forming, in its way, a separate handicraft. It is just because handicraft skill continues, in this way, to be the foundation of the process of production, that each workman becomes exclusively assigned to a partial function, and that for the rest of his life his labour power is turned into the organ of this detail function. Secondly, this division of labour is a particular sort of cooperation, and many of its disadvantages spring from the general character of cooperation, and not from this particular form of it. Section 2. The detail labourer and his implements. If we now go into more detail, it is, in the first place, clear that a labourer who all his life performs one and the same simple operation converts his whole body into the automatic, specialized implement of that operation. Consequently, he takes less time in doing it than the artificer who performs a whole series of operations in succession. But the collective labourer, who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such specialized, detailed labourers. Hence, in comparison with the independent handicraft, more is produced in a given time, or the productive power of labour is increased. Footnote. The more any manufacture of much variety shall be distributed and assigned to different artists, the same must needs be better done, and with greater expedition, with less loss of time and labour. The Advantages of the East India Trade, 1720. End of footnote. Moreover, when once this fractional work is established as the exclusive function of one person, the methods it employs become perfected. The workman's continued repetition of the same simple act, and the concentration of his attention on it, teach him by experience how to attain the desired effect with the minimum of exertion. But since there are always several generations of labourers living at one time and working together at the manufacture of a given article, the technical skill, the tricks of the trade thus acquired, become established, and are accumulated and handed down. Footnote. Easy labour is transmitted skill. Thomas Hodgkin, Popular Political Economy. End of footnote. Manufacture, in fact, produces the skill of the detail labourer by reproducing and systematically driving to an extreme within the workshop the naturally developed differentiation of trades which it found ready to hand in society at large. On the other hand, the conversion of fractional work into the life calling of one man corresponds to the tendency shown by earlier societies to make trades hereditary, either to petrify them into castes, or whenever definite historical conditions beget in the individual a tendency to vary in a manner incompatible with the nature of castes, to ossify them into guilds. Castes and guilds arise from the action of the same natural law that regulates the differentiation of plants and animals into species and varieties, except that, when a certain degree of development has been reached, the heredity of castes and the exclusiveness of guilds are ordained as a law of society. Footnote. The arts also have, in Egypt, reached the requisite degree of perfection, for it is the only country where artificers may not in any way meddle with the affairs of another class of citizens, but must follow that calling alone which by law is hereditary in their clan. In other countries it is found that tradesmen divide their attention between too many objects. At one time they try agriculture, at another they take to commerce, at another they busy themselves with 2 or 3 occupations at once. In free countries they mostly frequent the assemblies of the people. In Egypt, on the contrary, every artificer is severely punished if he meddles with affairs of state or carries on several trades at once. Thus there is nothing to disturb their application to their calling. Moreover, Since they inherit from their forefathers numerous rules, they are eager to discover fresh advantages. Diodorus Siculus. End of footnote. Quote, "The muslins of Dakar in fineness, the calicoes and other piece goods of Coromandel in brilliant and durable colours, have never been surpassed. Yet they are produced without capital, machinery, division of labour, or any of those means which give such facilities to the manufacturing interest of Europe. The weaver is merely a detached individual, working a web when ordered of a customer, and with a loom of the rudest construction, consisting sometimes of a few branches or bars of wood put roughly together. There is even no expedient for rolling up the warp. The loom must therefore be kept stretched to its full length, and becomes so inconveniently large that it cannot be contained within the hut of the manufacturer, who is therefore compelled to ply his trade in the open air, where it is interrupted by every vicissitude of the weather." Unquote. Footnote. Historical and descriptive account of British India, etc., by Hugh Murray and James Wilson, etc. The Indian loom is upright, that is, the warp is stretched vertically. End of footnote. It is only the special skill accumulated from generation to generation and transmitted from father to son that gives to the Hindu, as it does to the spider, this proficiency. And yet the work of such a Hindu weaver is very complicated compared with that of a manufacturing labourer. An artificer who performs one after another the various fractional operations in the production of a finished article must at one time change his place, at another his tools. The transition from one operation to another interrupts the flow of his labour, and creates, so to say, gaps in his working day. These gaps close up so soon as he is tied to one and the same operation all day long. They vanish in proportion as the changes in his work diminish. The resulting increased productive power is owing either to an increased expenditure of labour power in a given time, that is, to increased intensity of labour, or to a decrease in the amount of labour power unproductively consumed. The extra expenditure of power demanded by every transition from rest to motion is made up for by prolonging the duration of the normal velocity when once acquired. On the other hand, constant labour of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a man's animal spirits, which find recreation and delight in mere change of activity. The productiveness of labour depends not only on the proficiency of the workman, but on the perfection of his tools. Tools of the same kind, such as knives, drills, gimlets, hammers, etc., may be employed in different processes, and the same tool may serve various purposes in a single process. But so soon as the different operations of a labour process are disconnected the one from the other, and each fractional operation acquires in the hands of the detail labourer a suitable and peculiar form, alterations become necessary in the implements that previously served more than one purpose. The direction taken by this change is determined by the difficulties experienced in consequence of the unchanged form of the implement. Manufacture is characterized by the differentiation of the instruments of labour, a differentiation whereby implements of a given sort acquire fixed shapes, adapted to each particular application, and by the specialization of those instruments, giving to each special implement its full play only in the hands of a specific detail labourer. In Birmingham alone, 500 varieties of hammers are produced, and not only is each adapted to one particular process, but several varieties often serve exclusively for the different operations in one and the same process. The manufacturing period simplifies, improves, and multiplies the implements of labour by adapting them to the exclusively special functions of each detail labourer. Footnote. Darwin, in his epoch-making work on the origin of species, remarks with reference to the natural organs of plants and animals, "So long as one and the same organ has different kinds of work to perform, a ground for its changeability may possibly be found in this, that natural selection preserves or suppresses each small variation of form less carefully than if that organ were destined for the one special purpose alone. Thus, knives that are adapted to cut all sorts of things may, on the whole, be of one shape, but an implement destined to be used exclusively in one way must have a different shape for every different use." End of footnote. It thus creates at the same time one of the material conditions for the existence of machinery which consists of a combination of simple instruments. The detail labourer and his implements are the simplest elements of manufacture. Let us now turn to its aspect as a whole.